And it works. It's a great pleasure to be invited back up to the Owen Sound Field Naturalists. I'm very happy to share this presentation on the American Kestrel, which is a backyard bird for me now for the last 4 years. And this slideshow sort of encompasses my experience with it in the first couple of years that it joined my neighborhood. So the American Kestrel, this is a map showing the distribution across North America, and it extends down into the Caribbean and into South America as well. You can see that the breeding range, that we're located in the breeding range, but not technically in the winter range. But you can take that with a little bit of grain of salt because it's not like it's a solid line that they follow. We have American kestrels in our Christmas bird count based out of Walkerton in most years. I think we only missed 1 year in the last 30 or 40 years where we didn't have an American kestrel. And in 1987, that was our record year. We had 32 birds during our Christmas bird count that year. So there definitely can be found in this area year round. The American kestrel is sexually dimorphic. We have the male on your left side. The male tends to have a pale buff, but it can even be pinkish to orange front. The female is more creamy to buff and heavily streaked with brown. In their wings, the male kestrel's wings are kind of a blue-gray color, whereas they're rufous and barred with black in the female. And the male's tail is rufous with a single broad subterminal black band with a white rufous tip to it, whereas the female has a rufous tail with the black bars throughout the length of the tail. And then we have the stripes on the head of the kestrel, starting with the malar stripe, which is a vertical black stripe that goes across the malar region, which is sort of the cheekbones, and it's very common marking to see in falcons. And then we have their auricular stripe by the ear, and then we have the nape stripe, or sometimes referred to as the eye spots. Now, dozens of raptors sports these deceptive eye patches, sometimes called ocelli on the back of their heads, or false eye spots. And animals that typically have these, we tend to think of as prey species, like moths with the eye spots on the wings, or certain small fish species will have eye spots towards the tail to deflect predators from more vital organs. But the kestrel is a raptor. It's a predator. And why would they have eyes in the back of their head? And one theory is that these eyes are in the back of the head to serve as self-defense, because many of the prey species will sometimes mob hawks and kestrels if they find them in their territory. And it's thought that maybe these eyes in the back of the head might help them a little bit from being poked in the back of the head when they're getting mobbed by these little birds. The American kestrel is our smallest North American falcon. And like many raptors, there's a sexual size dimorphism, the female being about 10% heavier than the male. This is showing the weight and length differences. So with the male being anywhere from 80 to 140 grams and overlapping the female 86 to 106, but on average about 10% heavier. And just a quick review of the falcons that we do have in our area. The Merlin, it's slightly bigger, averaging about 210 grams or about 20% larger than the kestrel. They lack the well-defined facial stripes, and they do have a dark tail with several narrow bands across the length of the tail, but they lack any rufous in their plumage dorsally, so not likely to be confused with the kestrel. The Merlin are swifter in flight. They have more powerful wing beats like the larger falcons and stiffer primary feathers. They can make sharp turns at high speed, ideal for catching and eating birds. The peregrine falcon is much larger, 1,500 grams or about 90% larger than the kestrel, with a very broad and distinctive malar stripe. I remember getting my first pair of 10 times binoculars, and I went on a birding hike at Cabot Head with Ted Chesky. I was leading the hike, and I had my binoculars up, and I saw this huge falcon, and I go, "There's a peregrine falcon." And Ted was right beside me, and he goes, "Is it near the American Kestrel?" And I was a little bit not used to this magnification of my new binoculars. So I said, "Never mind, never mind." And another falcon that we don't get to see often enough is the Gyr falcon, also much obviously larger than the kestrel, about 85% larger. They have three different forms. There's a dark and a gray and a white. This is the white form. The darker forms have the malar stripes, but you don't tend to see that on the white form, which is the one that I have seen so far. And just for fun, the crested caracara is also in the falcon family. And they have been seen in Ontario. Last in Wawa in 2016, one made quite a splash. And the first one ever found in Ontario was a dead bird found in Thunder Bay. They had one on Pelee Island back in '94 and in Fort Albany, which is a remote First Nations community. So 4 different times we've had this bird, not likely to be confused with the kestrel, I suspect. And then we have the prairie falcon, also much larger, about 70% larger than the kestrel. Distinct malar stripe, not quite so dramatic in the auricular stripe, and there's no eye spots on this one, and it also lacks that rufous coloration. It's a Western species, but there have been 5 confirmed sightings of prairie falcons in Ontario, at least up to 2019 when I last looked. So I have this slide called The House That Jerry Built. Some of you might know Jerry Asling. He's a former president of Saugeen Nature now, or Saugeen Field Naturalists at the time. And he made this Kestrel slash Screech Owl box that was auctioned off at one of our AGMs. And I was lucky one to get it and had it sit around for a year or two and eventually mounted it onto my workshop just off the back deck from our house. So it has about a 10-inch square base and about 19 inches tall in the back and a little bit shorter in the front to give a bit of a slope for the roof. And I added that little perch underneath just to give something a little more photogenic for it to land on, with great hopes that I had that something would actually be interested in the box. And it was mounted about 13 feet, essentially from ground level to the top of the hole. Nothing magical about that number. That was just the size of my shed. So that's where it went. And I had a ladder that could go that high. And this is sort of a bird's eye view, we'll say, from the nest hole, standing with the camera at the nest hole and looking at my backyard. We have an additional perch that I added to give the kestrels to perch on before getting to the nest box, also with photography in mind. It's hard to appreciate, but those little circles are my bluebird boxes. And that's a whole another talk about bluebirds nesting next to my kestrel box, but that's a different story. And in the little red, might be a little hard to see over to the right. Those are my bird feeders. All the good things if you're a kestrel looking at these. And then my back deck, that's where I was set up my blind to try and photograph the kestrels. So I needed to do the photography from a blind so as not to disturb the nesting pair. The male in particular was very wary of any change or movement. The female, a little more dedicated to the nest, she would put up with me moving around, like we'd be on the back deck barbecuing and stuff, and she would just attend things as per normal, but the male wouldn't come anywhere near us if he could see us out on the back deck. So I started with a bar stool and my tripod and a bag blind, and I left it on the deck most of the time just so they would get used to the presence of those things. And I would attempt to get into the bag blind when the kestrels weren't visibly around. That didn't always work so well. And then I decided that I needed to get a little more height to get a better perspective in terms of the background. So I have some scaffolding and I made myself a little chair that when I would sit on it, my head would just be under the soffit there. So that's as high as I could get sort of on my deck. And then I would just have the bag blind sitting over that during the day. When I'd come home from work, I would go into it. So and even in the bag blind, you had to be very careful to keep movement down. Like the wind would be blowing it and things, but my movement when if the male was around, he would just take off instantly. It was amazing how aware he was of his environment. Get pretty hot sitting in a bag on the back of your deck there. It's a little bit unnerving to hear a car come down your driveway after you've stripped down a bit and you're sitting in a bag and then someone's coming down the driveway. So anyway, that was my wife's job to head them off. And then after my first year experience, I decided for a winter project that I was going to build myself a much better blind. This is basically a plywood blind that I made fit just under the roof on top of the scaffolding and colored it up a little bit and a little opening for the camera to stick out of. It was nice because it was permanently there. I could move all I wanted inside. It wasn't disturbing to the birds. I made a little, I called it my Coke door that could slide up from the bottom so my wife could deliver me Coke. And I had many a supper actually in this blind too. And I also had an extension cord with a fan, so take care of the heat. This was luxury. It's just some inside and a little platform for my camera to rest on, and just sort of like some curtains that I had in front to shoot through. So I also set up, my brother-in-law also does a lot of photography, and I didn't want to share the other blind with him. So I had a second one set up also just to give a different angle and different backgrounds for the bird. And that was a shot of the blind sort of up 2 levels of scaffolding, and you could see the one perch. And so I was able to be high enough not to have white sky as a background for the shots. So, although Kestrels might look at the neighborhood with some excitement, I would say that the neighbors were maybe a little less excited to be sharing their neighborhood with the Kestrels. And you might be able to see the advantages of having eyes in the back of your head, those eye spots with the birds coming in to mob them. The tree swallows were particularly good at doing this, but they were also harassed by eastern kingbirds, great crested flycatcher, eastern phoebe, and the bluebird occasionally would take a run at it as well when they were perched. And the perch that I had by the kestrel box. So the neighborhood birds, I mean, this is while the kestrels are nesting and hunting for food. And I was set up on the perches for the kestrel come back, but these were the sort of neighborhood birds that would come up and perch right by the kestrel box. They clearly were aware of its presence, and I had never knowingly seen any of my backyard birds being taken by the kestrel. We'll talk a little bit more about kestrel food in a bit here. But I think these birds were very much aware of the predator in their midst, and were somewhat hyper vigilant, we'll say. So this is a sort of Google view of this represents roughly about 1 square kilometer. And that's roughly the size of the territory around the nest box, which is sort of dead center there, that they will tend to defend fairly aggressively against other kestrels entering in. Their actual territory, though, is probably about 10 square kilometers. And it's not that it's a perfect circle, of course, but this would give you an idea of the habitat in the area. A lot of farm areas, but also this Beatty Saugeen River cutting through the middle of it and giving some river valley and sort of mixed forest habitat. But I think the kestrels were more in the open areas, more so that you would see them hunting. So my first year with the nesting pair, there were many great opportunities. of the adults bringing food to the box. But there was also a great many questions that I had about what was going on inside the box. How many eggs were being laid? When did it happen? How many chicks were there? How old were they? Wouldn't it be cool if I could actually time it to be off when the chicks are fledging and leaving the box? So that was sort of something I was aspiring to do. I was trying to figure out maybe when that eggs were hatching so that I might be able to guesstimate a little bit about when they might attempt to fledge. And these were all shots from that first year. So incubation averages in the literature from 29 to 30 days. Typically, fledging occurs around 28 to 31 days. I thought I might have heard the first peeping or begging noise from a chick on June the 19th. So this was the first appearance to my knowledge of the chick showing up at the nest hole itself. And this was about 27 days after I first heard the peeping. So I was guessing that they might fledge in the next 1 to 4 days. So why a muskrat? Well, obviously it's because I don't have any pictures of rats, which is what I was saying when I was at work and my wife calls me on the phone frantically saying, the adults are screaming and carrying on. They have a big mouse, but they won't bring it to the box. The babies are screaming, oh my God, one of the babies just jumped out of the box. More babies, babies everywhere. I think the muskrat is also frowning or pouting, and I think that's also what I was doing that day at work while she was telling me this. This was about 35 days after I thought I heard peeping from the box, maybe. I did manage to get home eventually that night, and I did see on my bluebird boxes a couple of the fledged young, and and I was able to get a few photos of them on the perches. No real idea how many chicks there were. At least three. I saw two females and a male chicks, so there was at least that many. There may have been more. My wife wasn't able to sort of stay and watch all the time, all the morning to see how many actually came out of the box. So three minimum, but possibly more. Um, for that breeding season, I spent a total of 70 hours in the bag blind over a 2.5 month period, basically from May 6th through to July 22nd. And so I was quite pleased with the photography opportunities I had, my best ever Kestrel photos. I won't even pretend to show you the ones I had before this experience, but I still had a lot of questions. So I did say it was a Screech Owl slash Kestrel box. So early in my career of birding, I remember asking a more seasoned birder how to find owls, and the advice I got was to look for the hole that isn't there. And at the time, I thought that was terrible advice. But it was interesting because in this occasion, it was snowing outside, and I was actually on my back deck taking pictures of snowflakes. And I had my reading glasses on, so because I was doing macro work. And I remember looking up and wondering, what happened to my hole in the box? And I had this flashback, so I ran into the house and got my regular glasses, and my hole that had disappeared was a screech owl sitting in the hole. Um, so now I was even more curious about what's going on in this box. How often is that owl there? Is the owl going to be there when the kestrels come back? Are the kestrels going to come back? Who wins that contest? I actually did a bit of a literature search trying to find out about this because they do tend to share the same nesting habitat, and I really couldn't find any literature sort of saying about kestrels and screech owls duking it out, and who would win the box. So with all these questions, I decided that I needed to know what was going on. And at the time, this is just at the beginning of COVID now, um, I came across this bird box camera from the UK. And it was a small camera designed to fit inside of a bird box or a bird feeder station, and and be connected to the house through Wi-Fi, so that you could actually look at what was going on from your smartphone or smart tablet or desktop computer. It had to be hardwired in, but that wasn't a problem because it was on my workshop, and I could and they provide a very long extension cord. I was able to hardwire that in. And while I was setting that up, which was on March the 13th, I had scaffolding up there and I was putting up the box with the camera and getting the wiring hooked up, and the male kestrel was back. And I'll see if this works here. It did not work. And now what am I going to do? Let's see here. Okay, we're going to be happy with that. What was supposed to happen was the call of the American Kestrel, and they call it a clee or a killie call, and it's a series of 3 to 6 notes like clee 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 clee. It was just sort of screaming at me while I was kind of hurried up as fast as I could, and within sort of an hour or so of getting out of there, the male Kestrel was in the box. I remember looking up to find that struck me March 13th. It struck me as being maybe early for what I had thought I had seen in the previously. Mike Burrell did some statistical analysis from using eBird data from the years 1900 to 2013. And for all the species in Ontario, he looked at the first sighting of each species and then made a judgment statistically when it was felt that maybe 20% of a given species was back on territory. And I can't remember exactly how he did the math of that. But for the American Kestrel, it turns out that that number is March 22nd. So by March 22nd, 20% of the population has returned is sort of the theory. And so this was, what did I say here? March 13th. So a little bit earlier than that, but well within what he had predicted. And there's the male kestrel in the box pretty much as shortly as I got down from it. Males typically arrive in the territory about 1 to 7 days before the female to begin to establish their territories. And as I said, true to form, the male was the first one into the box here. Females may visit several rival male territories before they decide which territory to settle in. But once she decides on that territory, she will then aggressively chase other females who are passing through the territory. In the courtship period, to advertise its territory, the male will engage in dive displays consisting of a series of climbs and dives while making those clee notes. Food transfers, usually from the male to the female, they begin about 4 to 5 weeks prior to egg laying and end about 1 to 2 weeks after hatching. The pair spend about 50% of the time together during this courtship stage. Copulation frequency is quite high, peaking about 18 days before the first egg is laid. And during the courtship time, one pair that was studied was estimated to have had 690 acts for their one clutch. You gotta love being a researcher sometimes, just counting all these things. But another study followed 16 different pairs, and they averaged 1 to 2 copulations per hour during the daylight. So an average of 330 times per clutch. Not like the 690 couple there. Prior to egg laying, the birds individually or together will inspect the box on a regular basis during the day. They don't add any material to the box. I have wood chips in the bottom of the box, and they would rearrange them a little bit. The female would sometimes press down with her breast and sort of wiggle around to make a shallow depression or scrape, which is kind of the most simple or basic of nest types, creating a little bit of a rim just to kind of keep the eggs more centralized. On most nights, one and often both birds would sleep in the box. The male with the clear breast is up on the top right there, and the female with the heavier barring. The crystals were not the only creatures checking out the nest box. Red squirrel was a frequent, until the kestrels were more around, let's just say. The starlings certainly frequently rooted in. And then one day there was just a lot of black feathers in the bottom of the box. That seemed to be the last of them. House wrens with grand ambition were looking at that. And that was the other one I had there too. And yeah, the house wren was the other one. So 38 days from when that male first arrived and went into the box as I was setting it up. And not certain as to the time, but the first egg appeared. You can sort of see there. Um, in this year, we had 2 weeks that were unseasonably warm, and then this egg appeared, and then we went very, very cold for the next week or two. Normally, they will lay their eggs every 1 or 2 days, but this egg was laid and then nothing for some time. Usually, they have a clutch size of about 4 to 5 eggs. So it was 10 days after the first egg and the weather warmed up that the second egg appeared. And this egg was laid 2 days, the third egg was laid 2 days after the second egg appeared. And it was fitting that sort of every other day pattern that the studies were suggesting was common practice. The camera angle doesn't really reveal the moment of egg laying. There are times where the female would seem to be brooding on the eggs and would have a lot of shivering and then eventually settle down and maybe look a little unwell. And I wondered if that was maybe an egg that she had laid. But from a top view, you couldn't really tell what was happening with that. Um, Most birds lay their eggs in the morning or early afternoon, and this is felt to be so that they don't have the extra weight to carry while they're flying during the day and hunting, and that the egg would have less chance of being damaged if they were able to get the egg out earlier in the morning. This egg, I estimated, was laid sometime after 2:45 in the afternoon because the video from just before then showed only 2 eggs. So it didn't appear to be a morning laid egg on this occasion, but it was a bit challenging to say that. And then this fourth egg was laid 2 days after the third egg. And again, seemed sometime after 6:30 p.m. So despite my reading of the literature, they weren't reading the same literature, apparently. The female typically begins incubation upon laying the penultimate egg. So penultimate meaning the second last egg is when she starts to incubate. The male contribution is variable in the literature, but both sexes do develop incubation patches, 3 in total, with a large belly patch and then a smaller pair higher up on the chest. These patches are larger in the female. They're featherless areas where the adult can actually get the skin against the eggs to help preserve the heat in the eggs. And I remember reading incubation and brooding, and in my mind I was interchanging these terms, but they actually mean something different. So incubation is about providing a favorable environmental condition for an embryo with an egg to develop. So think of turtles and crocodiles laying eggs in the sand, and so that's incubation. Brooding is the act of sitting on the egg to incubate them. So it's a little difference, but in those terms. So this egg was laid 3 days after the fourth egg. And so there's a little bar graph sort of showing the when the eggs were laid. That first outlying egg 10 days before everything else on April 21st, but the other 4 eggs sort of every other-ish day in sequence. And so the incubation began at the penultimate egg, the second last egg. And so now I had a bit of an idea of when they might hatch. So incubation during the day, from my observations, the male actually seemed to be doing a pretty good job. He was there about 50% of the time on the nest brooding the eggs. The female in the bottom right is looking up at the camera, but what she's really looking up at is a hornet or a wasp that entered the nest. That seemed to happen pretty frequently. She didn't seem to be all that excited or nervous about it. She certainly wasn't chomping at it. She'd just watch it fly around in circles until it would leave. I wondered. I was talking with Chris early at one point about bird boxes and insects, and he had seen many tree swallow nests with paper wasps, and certainly my bluebird nest box would often have paper wasps in it. They seem to coexist without any difficulty that I can see. It would seem a little bit annoying to have a wasp flying around your nest, mind you, but. So why do eggs need to be rotated? Both the male and the female would actively rotate their eggs. And here's a little time lapse showing the changing egg positions over a 24-day period. The purpose is basically to keep the yolk, which tends to float towards the top of the egg, centered in the egg. And this prevents the developing embryo, which is resting on top of the yolk, from being squished between the yolk and the eggshell and getting stuck to the membrane. The albumin, which is the egg white, is the embryo's fluid cushion and water supply. And turning the egg seems to optimize the fluid dynamics so the chick can absorb things properly. Then I wondered, well, what about turtle eggs? No one's digging them up to flip them around. What goes on with them? And obviously, they can't be turned. They have evolved differently. The turtle embryo actually attaches itself to the top of the eggshell. And if a turtle egg is turned, like if you're taking a nest and transporting the eggs and you flip the eggs over, those eggs typically won't survive. And another study showed, and I'm not sure if this is true for all turtles, but at least the turtle that they were studying, that the embryo could actually move in the egg to different positions to help thermoregulate themselves within the egg. So very interesting and different. But for birds, they rotate their eggs. So the incubation brooding began on or around May 5th, and about 31 days later, or around 30 days in the wild, the range being from 26 to 32. Oops, let's go backwards here. Is she moving? Let's see. There she goes. Yeah, okay. I can see her eating the eggshell there. In the literature, they will sometimes consume that to presumably conserve the calcium and get that back in. Sometimes they will remove the eggshell from the nest. And you can see the newly hatched, very wet and very frail looking nestling there. Here's another look of that first hatching. So each egg apparently takes about 48 to 52 hours to hatch from the first pip, which is the initial crack in the eggshell that the chick makes with its egg tooth on its beak, which is something that it loses after about a week or so after it's born. But with that little egg tooth, it can scratch the egg to weaken it and eventually make a crack. And they look like kind of wet and soaked. They usually take about an hour or so to dry out, but it kind of depends on the local humidity. And although they look very feeble, they can certainly raise their head, they can open their bill, and they can make vocalizations at this stage. So sometime in the 12 hours before this, two more chicks had hatched out. The previous image was at 10 o'clock at night, and this video is at 11 in the morning. And so we have now three fluffy chicks there, two unhatched eggs. You can see a discarded broken eggshell on the top left there. And you might notice the female tearing up an eastern garter snake, which, as far as I can tell, was the first solid meal for these young. Eyes are closed at birth, but they can partially open them by the end of the first or second day. Here we have the fourth chick, half out of its eggshell. And we can see that it's still looking sort of wet and feeble here. The fifth egg never did hatch, and I assume it was that first egg laid back on April 21st, 10 days before the second egg was laid. Literature says it takes 2 to 3 days for a clutch of 5 eggs to hatch, and the 4 that successfully hatched did that over a 2-day period, June 5th to the 7th. Here's the female with 4 fluffy chicks and 1 unhatched egg and another eastern garter snake for lunch. The male that was at the box about 50% of the time when the eggs needed brooding, once the young hatched, he basically never came into the nest anymore. He would catch food, typically transfer it to the female. If it was large, the female would go outside the box to get it from him. And if it was smaller, he would go into the nest hole and just reach down and give it to the female, and she would distribute it to the young. Okay, here's a nice action shot for you. So to defecate, yes, you're welcome. The young would generally back up, raise their tails, and squirt their feces onto the walls of the box. and where it would dry off. There's a fairly high ammonia content to this, which some researchers have commented on significantly. But the ammonia seems to serve as a bit of a deterrence to bacterial buildup in the nest. And most of a lot of different nests, but kestrel nests in particular, will end up getting various scavenger beetles in the nest that will say infest the nest, but really they're in the material below the nest and all the various hair and bones and meat that doesn't get consumed. Not to mention the feces, the bacteria or the beetles will break down and into sort of an almost odorless refuse that sort of accumulates in the bottom of the box under sort of the wood chips and stuff. The female, if a carcass is uneaten or not completely consumed, the female typically will remove it from the nest. Not sure if she will eat it herself or finish it off, or if she just dumps it somewhere. I could never, and certainly did not dump anything near the nest to advertise the nest's presence. So underneath the kestrel nest box, it was always very clean. So this is going to be a little mini slideshows showing the fledglings over a 26-day period. So in the first week, the female would regularly brood the fresh hatchlings. After that, she would typically only at night, or if it was cooler weather, she would come into the box to brood them. As I mentioned, the male would rarely ever enter the box now. For the first week, the male would bring all the food and hand it to the female, who would tear it up and then feed them rather tenderly. Generally, the largest and hungriest and most aggressive chick would eat first, but then would move aside when full, and the female would work her way through to the youngest. After the first week, both parents would bring food. In the literature, they say the female would account for about 70% of the feeds, which seemed about right to me. Notably, she would tend to bring smaller prey like insects. I got the impression that she hunted near the nest box, and the male would visit less frequently, but he would bring larger prey. So I think he was hunting further away in the territory, and he would bring back the larger things, and the female would stay kind of in eyesight of the box just in case something was going on. So she caught what she could kind of closer to the nest box. And the male, the rodents and birds and snakes, the male would typically be the one catching them and bringing them. The young would often flap their wings in the nest to practice, which looks kind of annoying to the siblings. So over the 2 years, I photographed 194 instances of food being brought to the nest and the chicks. The food was brought most commonly. It was insects by far, and then mammals, followed by birds, reptiles, and worms. So in that time, I had 15 different birds were photographed over the 2 years that were brought to the nest. Most of the time, I couldn't identify them. Most of them were decapitated and plucked. So they just looked like little chickens that were being brought back. But you could see often pin feathers on them, which suggested that they were young or recently fledged birds. But as to species, it was very challenging to say what that was. That represents about 8% of the prey so birds represented about 8% of the prey that were brought to the nest. So helminths or worms. This kind of surprised me a little bit, kestrels catching worms. And it represents about 3%. It was 5 times that I saw them bring worms to the box, which is about 3% of the total. It is in the literature that they have in other places been documented to bring worms, and mostly just commented that they're opportunists and they will basically catch anything they can catch and bring. What was interesting to me, and I don't know how long he had to practice doing this, but to me, I would have grabbed that worm in the middle and bent it in half, and it would have been easier to get in the box. But he always was holding it from just the end. And what he could do almost perfectly for the sort of the 3 or 4 this one I saw him mess up and not really get in. But after that, what he would do is he would fly, and just before he got to the hole, he would break, his wings would come out, and the worm would swing forward like a pendulum, and he could just thread the needle with the worm going right through the hole into the box like that. And I thought, but that's really amazing to me. So mammals, there was 18 documented in total. It was just 9% of the total food that I saw brought. Early in the nesting, the female would take this kind of prey into the box and she would tear it up into bite-sized pieces to feed the young. But after about 2 weeks, she would just dump it into the hole and the young would tear it up themselves. This is, I think, a masked shrew. And reptiles, they represented, even those that seemed to be their first couple of breakfasts, those eastern garter snakes, that it was about 3% of the total, including this beautiful red-bellied snake. And it was just the one red-bellied snake, and all the rest were eastern garter snakes. But really, the bulk of their diet by far was insects. 77% of the total diet was insects, with the largest proportion being grasshoppers. There was 108 recordings of grasshoppers. So 72% of all meals were grasshoppers. Other insects were certainly there, but by far, grasshoppers were the biggest meal to the young. So the literature suggested that the departure from the nest or fledging occurs between 28 and 31 days, and as early as 27, and in captivity as early as 26. So we were 28 days out. So now I knew exactly when they fledged. And I was determined that I was going to witness this fledging and photograph it. And I had my brother-in-law come up as well. And I thought between the two of us, we're going to have different angles and have better luck at doing this. So we were prepared. All the young were in the box, and we were setting up with our cameras, and we were expecting a spectacle, as my wife described the year before, with screaming and teasing and things being coaxed and things like that. So we thought that would be pretty obvious. And for the past week, the young were perched at the hole, sort of looking out on a regular basis and sort of getting pushed from behind, and it looked like things were coming to a head. So we were in our blinds, and at 11:40, the eldest male, who had been sitting in the hole there for like an hour at that point, just looking around, he just jumped and was gone. No fanfare. Both Scott and I were looking at our phones. I don't know what we were doing. Neither of us. Scott just said, "It's gone." It just jumped, and so no pictures, nothing. So we basically then didn't blink for 11 hours and stared at that hole, and nothing happened. So that male jumped out at 11:40 in the morning. I was determined not to mix the next chick's departure. And I had actually scheduled vacation to be off, for these days of this happening. So I decided, I had planned I would get into my blind. I'd be there for 7:30 in the morning, hours before fledging time. So as I was having my breakfast cereal, I checked my little feed and saw that at 7:01, the next oldest male left the nest. Again, no fanfare, just gone. So I spent 12 hours not blinking that day in my bird blind, and nothing else happened. So, and I think, well, this is the 7:01 here. I'll let you watch his tail disappear. His sister in the bottom is just sleeping away, and the little brother's kind of who is the youngest one, is just kind of wondering what's going on here. And a few little flaps, and he's gone. So missed him too. The camera, when it's dark, will take a black and white image, and so when they're sitting in the hole, it darkens everything, so it's black and white. And once they jump out of the hole, then I get sort of a color image again. So the next day, I was in the blind before sunrise, and the female was sitting in the hole here, and she was leaning out a little bit far. I took hundreds of shots of this event, filling up my buffer of my camera. It wasn't fledging, it was just awkward and was falling out of the hole and trying to get back in again. that she managed to get herself back in the hole. So now, but she looked like something was going to happen. So no adult, no fanfare, no screaming, no tempting. She just basically started shuffling a little bit and she jumped. Yay for me. Again, yeah, no coercion, nothing like, I wonder what my wife had seen that previous year, but um, so that was her leaving her little brother behind. And 11 minutes after his sister left the nest, the male did as well. He did the same sort of shuffling at the hole and then his leap. Again, no parental encouragement. Um, in the end, the brood fledged over a 3-day period. The sister before him jumped and flew across our whole open field to the row of trees. He landed about 12 feet down onto observatory there. But he sort of gathered himself up a bit and then took another sort of run and fly and managed to cross the field in one go and into a low tree. Where he was initially fairly close to the ground. Didn't attempt to fly, but he spent about an hour climbing the tree, going up one branch to another branch, another, and eventually got himself fairly high up into the tree, calling frequently for his parents to come and feed him. So during the first 2 weeks, the siblings, they were in my field area. They more or less were doing their training there. They're using my bluebird boxes as perches for the most part. And the siblings would often perch together, keeping each other company. But were quite dependent on the parents for their food for that first 12 to 14 days in particular. They would beg frequently, and the adults would capture food and bring it to them. Meanwhile, they would sort of test fly, trying to catch the caterpillar or grasshoppers and things that were around in the grass. Not overly successful in the beginning, but as time went on, they got to be a little more coordinated and they were beginning to catch things for themselves. Parents were still very protective of their young. We had crows around, which are certainly well known to catch and eat fledgling birds, and the mother was not having any of that around, so she would harass the crows till they left the area. And these were the last shots I managed to get. This is the youngest male. You still see a trace of down on the top of his head. This image was taken about 6 days after fledging, which was July 11th. So this was the second year. I had spent another 55 hours in the blind from June 6th to July 11th, combined with the first year of 70 hours. So a total of 125 hours, which was 5 days and 5 hours worth of living in a blind to get to the end. I'm happy to have any questions if anyone has anything. Yes, yes. So the answer to that is yes. And the first year I tried to do it while I was up there and had the wind blow a lot of that stuff into my face. So I did not do that the next year. And it's not easy to clean. I use almost like a barbecue brush on the sides to try and get that material off. So I did as best I could the first year, and they nested in the same box in the second year. This year, I actually remade the box and put, instead of a camera on the top, I've made a bump out side. So the camera's now looking sort of side view into them. And the kestrels have returned, both the male and female. And I can show you if you're interested on my phone, they might be in the box sleeping right now, even potentially. I didn't make this one deep enough with the wood chips because when they go in there, they will sometimes, as they're moving things around, they'll just start kicking wood chips, and they're all up by my camera in the side pouch, and they're down to wooden floor. So I think this weekend my plan is to load it up with even more wood chips. I can tell when they're not in the box, if they're out hunting in the day. I'll put on my helmet and ladder and someone to watch me, and I'll just dump a few more wood chips in. But it's a bit early for them to be laying eggs, but they're most nights they're roosting in the box. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. That that was about did I clean the nest boxes, but I'll repeat these next ones. Yeah, it stayed in the box the whole time, and I think I can't remember now if it was crushed in the end with the young sort of all around and stuff like that. I didn't it wasn't a savable thing by the time I was cleaning the box. Yes.
Still photography, the striking thing about the image, of course, is your depth of field where the background's all blurred, so you can focus on all the details of birds. I was just wondering, in terms of your focusing, did you have a preset, like you